It's 1931, and the Castellamare War is raging on the streets of New York City. Though it's named after a small town in Sicily, this war is going to be one of the major turning points in the history of the American Mafia. Squaring off are two old-school Sicilian mafia bosses, battling it out for control of New York's underworld. You see, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria has been running things in New York's Italian community. This is before everything gets divided up with the five families. Now, Salvatore Maranzano, another major boss, has arrived from Sicily and threatens to take power from Masseria. But it's not just a battle for control between two bosses. There's undercurrents at play too. These two dons are Mustache Pete's, a name used to describe older mafiosos who grew up in Italy and are stuck in the old country ways of doing things. And they're starting to be questioned by their younger soldiers. There's a generational split in the New York mob, and the younger mafia guys, many of whom grew up in the United States, see things differently. They recognize a changing world, and they want to do business with everyone, not just Southern Italians. And they want to do it in a more organized and profitable way, not by having bloody gang wars in the streets all the time. Leading the charge of these young mobsters is Salvatore Lucky Luciano, a name that anyone remotely familiar with organized crime is going to know. Luciano knows what needs to be done for the future of the mafia, and that is the elimination of both of these old-timers. It doesn't matter who wins this initial war. All that matters is that both end up getting dealt with. So he cuts a deal with the boss of the faction that is supposed to be his rival. Lucky's gonna hit his boss, Joe Masseria, and then he gets to become his rival, Salvatore Maranzano's second in command. It's a pretty devious plan. And to pull off this hit, he needs some very trusted killers. One of the men he turns to is a ruthless killer by the name of Albert Anastasia. Anastasia's gotta be careful though, because if word of this gets out before the move is made, Luciano, Anastasia, they're all finished. A decade earlier, Luciano had actually rescued Anastasia from death row after hearing about his potential as a mafia soldier. He knows that the vicious Anastasia can be trusted to carry out all types of violence. You don't eventually get the nickname the Lord High Executioner for being a friendly guy who doesn't know how to get a murder done. The plan is set, and Luciano calls a meeting with his boss, the target Masseria, at his favorite Coney Island restaurant. They enjoy the meal, and afterward, Luciano excuses himself to go to the bathroom. You know what's coming. As soon as he disappears, Anastasia and three other gunmen rush in and kill the boss man who had been sitting opposite Luciano. The hit, as big of a deal as it seems in the moment, is actually even more important than it first appears. It's going to pave the way for the foundation of the modern mafia as we know it. It's also the beginning of the rise to power of Albert Anastasia, one of the most ruthless and psychotic bosses in American history, who eventually heads up the Italian and Jewish murder-for-hire agency known as Murder Inc. This is the Underworld Podcast. Welcome back, folks, to the Underworld Podcast, an audio experience that takes you, the listener, on a journey through the wild and wacky world of international organized crime of the past, present, and future, hosted by two journalists, myself, Danny Gold, and Englishman Sean Williams. We've reported on this sort of stuff around the globe for years and years and years, and every week we trade off hosting duties while the other chimes in with the occasional terrible joke or words of insight. Sean, how goes it? You got a lot of assignments these days, huh? Making those long-form writing dreams work.
Yeah, just living the dream, one disgusting chopped up Google Doc at a time. I mean, I'm all good over here, just like looking forward to the test match on the weekend, which I have a ticket to. So that's 8 hours on my backside talking about batting averages from the 1920s with a pal. And that is the dream. Also, here's an exclusive. Actually, this is pretty cool news. I just found out my partner got a posting to Buenos Aires. So we're actually moving there in, I think, 15, 16 months from now. So that's pretty exciting, eh? So my Spanish pronunciation is going to get better. And we're going to be doing like bonuses from that, I don't know, Bolivian prison where they make cocaine and I don't know, stuff like that. So that is going to be quite fun.
Yeah, what's that gang there that guy Los Manos? You should
Los
you
Manos,
got 16 months, make some friends. Get involved,
Yeah.
Maybe get involved, maybe like go through a
gang.
midlife crisis, and actually join the gang. I feel like that would be good for our audience and just getting more listeners. Yeah, I'm back from Tokyo. I saw a friend of the show, Jake Adelstein, the Tokyo Vice guy, and he has a new book out called Tokyo Noir, which is excellent. So go ahead and buy that. But I got to tell you, man, coming back from Tokyo into New York City, just a trash jump. Like, I got to get out of here, at least. Like, move apartments, maybe go south for the winter. Do we have any listeners with like villas in Key West or somewhere where it's going to be 80 degrees and the internet works? Just, get at me. But as always, we have bonus episodes at patreon.com/underworldpodcast. You can also sign up on Spotify or on Apple Podcast. Email us at theunderworldpodcast@gmail.com with tips or compliments, no complaints, and buy our merch at underworldpod.com. Then click on the merch category, some solid clothing items and more for all your holiday shopping needs.
Yeah, speaking of holiday shopping, my mum just sent us one of those elves on a shelf, which, sorry, mum, you don't listen to this, but I'm not playing ball with that bullshit. It actually got me down a really weird rabbit hole of trying to find out where they're from. So if anyone knows where elves on the shelves are made in China and where they actually come from, is that organized crime? It kind of is, right? Just drop me a line because I can't figure it out and it's become an obsession. So, yeah, I can always hear you frowning down the line at me now, Danny, so I'll let you carry on.
Yeah, we're getting carried away, and I had a whole segment I wanted to do on Japanese toilets, but this was done. This episode was done Thanksgiving week, so maybe not my best work. I got back from Japan. I was delusional, but I am thankful for, Sean, is our listeners who help us get our download numbers up, and all of our patrons who allow me to spend way too much money on Japanese denim. No worries, I'm gonna make it all back gambling.
Yeah, Danny's now walking around Crown Heights in turned up Ivisu jeans and flat caps and taking photos on his Leica. Japan ruined him.
Now, Umberto Albert Anastasia is born in Calabria in 1902 into a big family of 9 children. We don't know a lot about his childhood, but as you hear more, you'll probably think that he was one of those kids who tortured cats or something along those lines. His father dies in World War I, and Anastasia and 3 of his brothers decide to jump ship in New York City. They've been working on a freighter, and I think at a dock there. They were deckhands. So he arrives in New York City illegally in 1919 at the age of 17, which coincidentally is the year another majorly influential mobster pulls off his greatest move, Arnold Rothstein, and fixing the World Series.
Yeah, which we should also do a show on, by the way, because it would at least give me another excuse to read the original Shoeless Joe, which is the book that Field of Dreams became, and it is amazing. You should read it. It's almost nothing, like it's about 100 pages, but it's incredible.
People do like the historical episodes like this, so put it on the list. Anastasia gets to work on the docks. He becomes a longshoreman. And the docks in New York, I believe he's based in Brooklyn at this time, they are bustling. And they're a rough place to work. A lot of hardened dudes that, if there were disputes, they were going to settle them with violence. They would scrap with those big-ass cargo hooks. You know what I'm talking about? With the handles attached to them.
Jeez.
Yeah, and you would see dudes with just big scars on their face. I guess it was like the $1.50 of that era. It was almost a lawless place, and there was a lot of crime. Some of it of the organized variety, and Anastasia quickly established himself as a guy you don't want to mess with there, which says a lot about how dangerous he was, even when he's young. He's big, he's strong, he has these tremendous big hands, and he can knock people out with just one punch and just break faces, which is actually, back then they'd have boxing matches for like 117 rounds. So they were just tougher. So if you knock somebody out with one punch, that's formidable. After getting a pretty serious rap, he ends up heading up a gang of dock workers. I think his brothers were involved as well, who are involved in stealing cargo and other such sort of port crimes. But it doesn't take long before a different gang leader comes by and threatens him, tells him that he's the one who controls that area, and Anastasia needs to be paying him tribute, giving him a cut. And, Albert is not the kind of guy that takes lightly to that. They get into it. He erupts in a rage. His temper is going to become sort of like a calling card. And in this rage, he beats the guy to death in front of a bunch of people.
Jeez.
He gets convicted of murder in March of 1921 and is sentenced to death by electric chair. He's sent to the infamous Sing Sing prison in upstate New York to await his judgment day.
Is that place still going? Is Sing Sing to exist?
Yeah. It's in Ossining. It's like, I don't know, maybe an hour north of the city, depending on traffic.
Oh, wow.
And, if you're heading up to the Catskills, you will pass. I got friends that live in Ossining still, I think. But yeah, it is still there. So Albert Anastasia is in prison, and he's still as violent as ever, which, usually a guy named Albert, you figure he's going to not be a psychotic murderer. But this Albert, he is. He's wilding out. He's beating up other prisoners, terrorizing the other hardened criminals, and just being a real lunatic. Even though he's been sentenced to death, he does not calm down, which actually, I guess kind of makes sense when you think about it. Just like the docs, he quickly gains a reputation for violence, even in prison. And it's noticed by a man named the Barber, who is also known as Shiv, which, if that's your nickname in prison, you and everyone else know, like, what it is.
I feel like this is the guy who all modern barbers with beards who wear leather belts actually think they are. But yeah, this guy sounds pretty serious.
I support barbers, man. You can find a good barber, so I'm not gonna tolerate your insulting of them. You find a good barber, your life is. I'm looking for one right now, dude. It's tough going. The barber serves as sort of like a scout for criminal organizations. I guess a recruiter, maybe headhunter, whatever you want to call it. He thinks Anastasia has a lot of potential and would be the perfect guy for one of the mobsters that he's scouting for, who is Charles Lucky Luciano. This is the early 1920s, so Luciano isn't quite the famous mob legend he eventually becomes. And he's going to be a big part of this episode, too. It's almost like an episode on him. He's a rising star at the time, though, and all the various mobs and organized crime groups are currently battling it out during Prohibition, which is hands down probably the bloodiest time for organized crime in America, as everyone fights over control over the massive profits in the bootleg liquor market, which is actually kind of interesting to think about, which, I was doing as I was reading about this. Like, you look at the profit margins on cocaine right now, and you think about the percentage of the population that regularly uses it. It's got to be under 1%, probably under 1/10%. Yeah. I mean, even, you've got North Brooklyn and Berlin doing a lot of heavy lifting, but still, I guess we're talking about the US, but yeah, you've got North Brooklyn doing a lot of living in LA, but still, Miami, whatever. Think of how many people were probably drinking booze back then. Like, that is a market, bro.
Yeah, that is nuts. I mean, this is wildly off course, right? But one of the deadlines that I'm chronically failing to make right now is about Pacific drugs, and I hadn't figured out quite how insane the markups are in this part of the world. So a key of meth in Mexico, right? You can get it for $500 over there, and you can sell it here in New Zealand or like in Australia for up to 180 grand. I mean, even your crypto wallet isn't doing that well.
Yeah, they actually did the opposite. I invested $108,000 and I ended up with $500. I'm the only person who's ever repeatedly lost money. Well, I'm probably not the only, but anyway. Yeah, I mean, it's, I always wonder, they talk about the prices for this sort of stuff. And I know there's some money in New Zealand, right? But it's like, is the market really that big that people are spending that much money on meth, for that much of a markup? It's pretty insane.
It's estimated that 1.3% of the people take it regularly, which is a lot. But that would only be like a few thousand people. So I don't know, it's like 50, 55, 60,000 people or something. But that's enough that they can lose all these shipments, still make a profit, and they like still come in. So yeah, it's nuts.
Do you think you arriving there bumped it up to 1.4%? Like your massive amount of intake?
I like to think so. Yeah, I mean, how else would I survive?
Anyway, the barber sees Anastasia's potential for violence and learns about his background controlling things on the docks and figures he's going to be an immense help to Luciano, especially since a lot of moonshine is coming through those docks. So the barber sends word back to Luciano that he's got just the guy. And Luciano does this thing, which involves hiring fancy lawyers to get this conviction overturned on a technicality, eventually forcing a retrial, which they win. And oh yeah, also 4 witnesses from that first trial are murdered before the start of the second trial. And in 1922, Albert Anastasia is released from prison and heads to a new career in proper organized crime with the mob, a proper villain. He gets out and goes right back to work on the Brooklyn docks, where Italian organized crime groups are battling Irish runs for control. He proves to be quite a good soldier for the Italians, and Luciano right off the bat because, he's a violent psycho who can fight really well. I mean, he is perfect for a gang war. Soon, the Italians and Luciano, they seize control of the docks. I believe Anastasia and his brother would maintain control for something like the next 20 or 30 years or more. But in 1923, he actually ends up going back to prison for a 2-year stretch on a gun charge. The piers in Brooklyn at this time are some of the busiest in the world. They're 5 miles long, and anything within 5 blocks deep of them is controlled by Anastasia. Whether it's a shoeshine boy, a candy store, a bar, everything is paying. A nickel bag is sold in the piers. He is in on it.
And when we talk about the Brooklyn piers, like where are they? Are they down from the promenade or by Coney Island or something? I mean, even easier for me would be if you could triangulate by Cafe Grumpy branches.
Oh, Jesus. No, I think, Brooklyn Navy Yard, I think, was a part of it. And then those areas along, I guess where Brooklyn Heights is right now, a lot of those soccer fields,
Yeah.
so that whole area, I believe, were active piers at the time. A lot of those neighborhoods were just neighborhoods of people who worked on those docks, on the piers. These sort of like working class Italian and Irish neighborhoods, maybe Greek too. So, it was like, it was probably the biggest employer. I'm completely making that up, but I assume there's truth to it. One of the biggest employers in the city at that time. Not like, I guess it's not one employee, but you know what I'm saying? Like biggest industries, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. You could say, I mean, you can see down in the Heights, they've got all those like wood framed, they're like, they call them like sailor homes or dock homes or something like that, right?
Yeah. And that's exactly why.
Probably like 10 mil.
Yeah. I think Bay Ridge, I don't know if it went all the way down to Bay Ridge, but that whole area, it was docks. In the 1920s, he also links up with a guy by the name of Louis Capone, a mid-level gangster who basically acts like a mentor of sorts to the Brooklyn gangsters who are going to turn into Murder Incorporated. The Italian Ocean Hooligans is one facet, and the Jewish Brownsville Troop. Capone runs a restaurant. He feeds these kids, he advises them, he teaches them all that, and they do some errands for him. And there's going to be a bunch of names in this episode, but they're like kind of, pretty famous guys, so I feel like we can get away with it. We usually try to keep the names to a minimum. By the late 1920s, Anastasia is one of the leaders of the International Longshoremen's Association, which is the dock workers union. This is, right around the time the mob is really getting involved in labor rackets. And he controls 6 of the local chapters. We spent, I think, a decent amount of time over the years talking about the importance of controlling ports and unions, so I'll just leave it at that. Him and Luciano, though, who is powerful but not one of the main bosses just yet, they align themselves at first with Joe the Boss Masseria. He's in that war that we talk about in the cold open with Salvatore Maranzano. That's sort of ongoing. I believe late 1920s, early 1930s is really when it's kicking off. This is before the commission or the syndicate, which, we'll talk about in a minute, before the 5 families. New York is one big sort of it's yours for the taking city. What happens, though, with these younger guys is Arnold Rothstein, who many claim helped invent sort of modern organized crime, he takes on a bunch of these guys. They're kind of like street kids. They're thugs, gangsters from downtown. And there's some of the most famous mobsters out there. Young guns, including Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, Lepke Buchalter, and Lucky Luciano. And he basically cultures them, teaches them how to think, how to do business. Rothstein ends up getting killed, and those guys are kind of working together and decide they want to follow his lead and do things a new way. Not like the sort of off-the-boat mustache Pete's, Maranzano, Masseria, all their people who were stuck in this, only Southern Italians, bloody wars, all that sort of stuff. They want to be a different type of mobster. It's kind of like a quintessential America coming-of-age story, right? You've got these young up-and-comers. They think there's a better way. Of course, you still have the 2 main bosses who are vying for complete control, and that's where we get that war, the Castellamare. Did I say that right, John? Castellamare War, which kicks off...
Castellamare,
yeah. In early 1930. Soon enough, bodies are piling up on the streets, and Luciano, with Albert Anastasia as a sort of apprentice, really doesn't like how either of the old-time bosses are carrying themselves. He thinks this type of war is just bad for business, and also that the old-time bosses are making a mistake by refusing to do business with non-Italians. He's especially close to Luciano, with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and he sees that the new breed of criminal needs to modernize in the changing world, and that they would do better if they did business with Jews, Irish, basically anyone it makes sense with financially. And it wasn't just non-Italians. Generally, these guys didn't want to work with. The old-time Sicilians didn't even particularly like dealing with non-Sicilians, even though some of them had like Calabrians and other Southern Italians working with them. It shocks Luciano when one of the old-timers refers to one of his associates, Frank Costello, as a dirty Calabrian.
Is he even Italian? I feel like even today down there, they would call someone from a different village, like a pig or, I don't know, some Italian cuss that's like the curdled milk from the breasts of the Virgin Mary or something like that.
You know, these soft Americans, man, they don't understand good fashioned, like European, let's wage a 200-year war on the village next to us. And then have a holiday to remember this like battle from 1276. You know, that's the way proper Europeans get down. There's actually a really underrated mafia movie about this whole situation and the alliance between Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel. It's called Mobsters, and it's really, I love it. It's really worth watching. You got a young Christian Slater as Luciano, just fresh off gleaming the cube, and you know it's terrific. So Luciano makes this secret deal with Maranzano to take out his boss, Joe Masseria, and then become Maranzano's second in command. That's where we get that scene from the cold open and Masseria gets whacked. With Masseria out of the picture, the mafia is organized under the five-family model that we know of today, with Luciano becoming one of the bosses and Maranzano proclaiming himself capo de tutti capi, the boss of all bosses.
Love that ice cream flavor.
Yeah, it's the pistachios really make it. But Luciano isn't finished. His plan from the start has always been to get rid of both those guys. And it's not long before Maranzano is going to get taken out too. Maranzano, he's in the union game and he promises Lucky he won't start anything with his buddy, the Jewish mobster Lepke Buchalter, who eventually is going to co-lead Murder Inc. with Albert Anastasia. Because, you know, he knows Lepke and Luciano are tight and Maranzano is going to fake this sort of, you know, I'm going to leave your friends alone. But of course, Maranzano doesn't respect Lepke because he's not Southern Italian and violence breaks out. So Lepke is finally like, Lucky, let's move on this guy. Maranzano, though, is no slouch, and he recognizes that Luciano was gunning for him. So he brings in a top-notch killer, the Irish gangster Mad Dog Cole, to protect him and take out Luciano and Luciano's boys. But Luciano's sharp. When Maranzano calls him to his office for a meeting, Luciano, thinking he's done for if he shows up, organizes the hit, finally. He gets some Jewish gangsters to pose as police, fearing Maranzano won't recognize them, and they show up to his office building in disguise and get close enough to kill him. That night, Luciano and the crew, they take out a bunch of other old-time mustache gangsters as well. They're solidifying their takeover of the underworld in New York, and it's a new day, and Anastasia is along for the ride right near the top. Luciano has ideas, and this is where we get famously the commission, which is, you know, this thing where you've got the 5 New York families, some other big families, I think Buffalo, Chicago, Tampa Bay. They're part of the original commission, where the mafia starts being run like a board of directors. They have votes, they need to agree on things like hits, who gets what rackets, and settle their differences in a more corporate, peaceful way. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but there's a ton written and filmed on it if you want to look into it. But it was Luciano's way of doing away with the Wild West the streets had turned into. It's not that he was against violence. He was just against disorganized chaos and thought it benefited no one. Of course, it's the mob, so there's always a need for violence. And to dispense this violence, he creates a separate entity that will do the mafia killings and everything else, which is eventually dubbed Murder Incorporated. And to head it up, none other than one of his most trusted killers, Albert Anastasia. And in keeping with this new progressive mafia style of governing, it's also co-led with a Jewish gangster, Lepke Buchalter. Luciano goes over the rules with them. They're here to do contract killings, no killing of civilians or journalists or politicians or judges or mob bosses.
Well, it's like American democracy in action. Like kind of is, no joke.
I mean, it was a pretty innovative way of doing things, and it was very successful for the time.
Yeah.
This is just one more facet of the commission, or the syndicate as it's sometimes called. These are the men who basically made organized crime what it is today in America. When a gangster had a beef anywhere in the country and needed it resolved, they would come to the syndicate, and when the syndicate issues a ruling, like, it's done. There's no saying no. Maybe it's a threat, maybe it's money divvied up, maybe it's a death sentence. To this day, there's never been anything like Murder Incorporated, which I think they said had upwards of 1,000 bodies all over the United States over a decade or so. Murder Inc. carried out the sentence, whatever it was. It had to be respected, and you had to do the job. Killers were chosen by the commission, I guess actually by Anastasia and by Buchalter, and so was the methodology. They'd be flown out sometimes or drive across the country, and it wasn't just New York mobsters. You had LA, Kansas City, Detroit. The guy would get there, steal a car, or have an underling steal one for them, stake out the target. They usually have a local gangster there as the guide or fixer to make sure you got the right guy. All the local goons would make sure they had an alibi for when it went down. Then they would do it and fly home. Remember, this is the 1930s. No one knew what these guys looked like. Police departments weren't connected. There was barely a national police force. So if you did the deed and took off, it could be pretty hard to solve that crime, especially if you knew what you were doing and how to cover your tracks. Remember, this is the 1930s. No one knew what these guys looked like. Police departments weren't connected. There's barely a national police force. So if you commit the murder, then take off, it's going to be pretty hard for them to solve that crime, especially if, these are guys that knew what they were doing and how to cover their tracks. Anastasia could have probably just sat back and ordered hits left and right, but he's a guy who seems to enjoy getting his hands dirty. He actually went out there and killed himself. He was said to be involved personally in about 60 murders, which is where he got the nickname Lord High Executioner, which is, pretty solid nickname, I think. One of the gnarliest ones in organized crime history. Another one of his nicknames is the Mad Hatter, which, you guys get it.
Yeah, it's been a while since we had some solid gang nicknames on here. And again, it comes from a century ago. All the things that social media has done to the world, it's screwing up gang names. A better, simpler time.
Trouble for all the mobsters, though, starts brewing when Thomas Dewey, a prosecutor and district attorney, launches a war against the mob, his first target being Luciano. Dutch Schultz, another really prominent gangster, actually wants to assassinate Dewey, and they get Anastasia to stake out his morning routine by kind of heading to the neighborhood in disguise, pushing a baby stroller around. The commission, though, sees this as too far and they veto it, and this actually eventually leads to Murder Inc.'s biggest hit, which is when they kill Dutch Schultz, who's a mob boss himself, when it becomes clear that he doesn't respect the ruling. In July 1936, Dewey gets his way with Luciano, Anastasia's longtime ally and mentor, having put him away in jail for a minimum 30-year sentence for a prostitution ring. Next, Dewey targets Anastasia's co-manager, Lepke Buchalter, and charges him with murder. Lepke goes on the run and Anastasia goes to bat for his friend, using Murder Inc.'s expansive network to keep him in hiding. Next, Anastasia does what he does best and starts eliminating witnesses against Lepke. But FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover gets involved and it becomes too much publicity for the mobsters. The commission calls in Anastasia and basically tells him, look, we gotta sacrifice Lepke to protect ourselves. The commission tells Anastasia to meet with him and tell him that a deal is in place to save him from the death penalty, except no such deal exists. Anastasia knows this, but in 1939, he drives Lepke to meet with the FBI after 3 years of hiding to turn himself in. He's later executed in 1944, the first mob boss to get the death penalty. Mob historians would later say that if there was one thing Anastasia actually regretted, even though he was a killer and a lunatic, it was turning in his literal partner in crime, Lepke.
These guys are just absolute psychos.
Yeah, man. They dealt with it. People think because you talk with that accent or because they talk with that accent that they were, not as vicious because they're all, yeah, see, but they got down, man.
Wait, what's
they're like, yeah, see, yeah. Like the old timey gangster accent. In 1940,
yeah, man, that was
good, right? In 1940, Anastasia finds himself targeted on the Dewey firing line when one of Murder Inc.'s top hitmen, Abe Kid Twist Reles, gets caught up by the cops for a murder. Kid Twist decides to flip and he talks for 11 days straight, ratting on everyone. Eventually, he starts talking about Albert Anastasia, putting him on a bunch of murders, literally detailing where a lot of the bodies are buried. Anastasia goes into hiding, and at this point, the commission is really worried. This is basically when Murder Inc. gets exposed to the general public and gets its name. Kid Twist details everything. By this point, the commission knows they better step in and act or it'd be the end for all of them. But it's not easy. It's November 1941 and, slight digression, but it's kind of wild that all this is happening under the backdrop of World War II. Anyway, Kid Twist is under 24-hour police protection in his hotel room. He's set to testify in a few days. But at 3 a.m., the police go and check on him and he's sleeping. But when they go check on him again in the morning, he isn't in bed. The window of the 6-story hotel room is open and on the ground below is a dead Kid Twist. So no one really knows what happened, but yeah, they got to him. By the end of 1941, Murder Inc. is disbanded anyway, and Anastasia gets named underboss of the Mangiano crime family, which is one of the 5 families that comes into existence. You may not recognize that name because it's eventually renamed the Gambino family, which it carries to this day.
Yeah, I know that I ask this pretty much every time you do an oldie-timey New York show, but are the Gambinos up to much these days? I basically learn all about the US Mafia directly from you and the odd Netflix show every 6 months or so, and I've got to say you're a lot better.
I don't keep up with the day to day, but I feel like every 5 or 6 months there's like a big bust of like 20 or 30 guys from one of the families, or maybe smaller, maybe 5, 10. So they're still around for sure. I mean, they're nowhere near as powerful as they once were. Not even close, like a fraction of it. But they're still active. There's still guys in it. I don't know what I feel like they get brought down for, the occasional bit of violence, but loan sharking, I believe, is still a thing. People still need, even with payday loans on every corner, people still need loans. There's probably a lot of white collar stuff now, but it's kind of like, we've joked about this a lot. Yeah. It's like, all the stuff that they were famous for, you can get on a street corner, right? You can get payday loans with terrible rates. You can get weed. You can gamble on your phone. So, a lot of their bread and butter is not there anymore. And I don't know if they're smart enough to figure out the crypto scams, but maybe, who knows? All right, 1942 now. World War II is raging with the Americans entering the war. In February of 1942, a captured French ocean liner that's being refitted to transport troops is sunk in the port of New York in an act of sabotage, supposedly. According to Luciano and Meyer-Lansky, Albert Anastasia actually claimed that he was involved in the sinking, not because he wanted to sabotage the U.S., but because it was part of a plan to get Luciano a pardon, although reports in later years would confirm there was no sabotage. But it does get the U.S. Navy concerned, paranoid about sabotage at the port. U.S. Navy intelligence contacts Meyer-Lansky about a deal to protect the ports from potential sabotage from feared Nazi sympathizers. And Albert Anastasia is, of course, a big part of these negotiations since he still controls the docks. He also, of course, owes a debt to his mentor, Luciano, because if you remember, Lucky was the one who got Anastasia out of a death sentence at the start of this episode. The deal happens, and what it is that the government's going to pardon Luciano if the Mafia protects the ports, and Anastasia also agrees that there would be no dock worker strikes during the war. The deal also involves Luciano using his Sicilian contacts to help with the forthcoming invasion of Sicily, which is also a reminder for all of you to read Naples 44 if you get the chance. It's a great book about what happens when the U.S. does that. And it's fascinating, lots of organized crime stuff and like old school Italian mafia stuff. We really need to get back to that Amazon storefront that we had with all the book recs. I mean, there's so many ones we talk about every episode. And, the 3 cents for every book that you sell really adds up after a while. But there's just so much admin work, man. It never ends.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, it never ends. But then I realized, you do nearly all of it. And all I do is just lift and play football and then repeat. And that's my life. Yeah, that's all I do. But you look great. So this goes through and Luciano ends up getting that pardon at the end of the war. But before then, Anastasia actually joins the military in 1942 and trains soldiers to be longshoremen in Pennsylvania. He might have done this to finally get U.S. citizenship or to avoid some of the heat that was still kind of emanating off the whole Murder Inc. thing. But he gets honorably discharged in 1943 and moves to like a big mansion house in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which is right outside New York City. And it's kind of where New York rappers used to move when they blew up back in the day. See, while Albert is a ruthless killer, he's also a family man. And by that point, he's all about retiring to his suburban home to play that role with his wife and his 4 kids. This is a guy who gets it, Sean. When do I get my suburban dream home? I mean, Aramco pays pretty well for copy these days. You could do that.
I would get on the Neom wave, Like I'll move to Neom and do some sponsored content.
Oh my God, that would be the best thing, having you doing influencer videos from Neom.
Be incredible. And I'm in. But yeah, Anastasia is now out of the military and serving as the underboss. And Albert doesn't really like having a boss. He isn't the employee type. With Lucky in the commission, it was different. I mean, Lucky was the guy. But this, he actually views the underboss position as a demotion from being the head of Murder Inc. Now, in today's mafia, the underboss of a family, starts out a soldier in that same family and works his way up. Being maid, then being a captain, all that. But this was a different situation entirely, so it was kind of the start, right? Anastasia didn't work his way up in the Mangiano family. He was basically placed there because Murder Inc. was over and he was a mob power, and the commission had to find a place for him. So it's not exactly like Mangiano and Anastasia. They have some long-standing relationship where he was named the underboss. In fact, Mangiano resented Anastasia's close ties to Luciano and Frank Costello, and how sometimes Costello and Luciano would work with Anastasia without even asking Mangiano first. Did we get into Mangiano at all? I think I might have left that out, but
no, not really.
Yeah, his name was Vincent Mangiano. His nickname was the Executioner, which you can kind of see it, right? Like that pales in comparison to being the guy who is the Lord High Executioner. So if you're the Executioner and beneath you is the Lord High Executioner, like it's going to rub you the wrong way. You know what I'm saying? Mangiano, though, had been a big player during the Castellamare War when Anastasia was still kind of young and getting going, and he emerges as one of the 5 bosses under Maranzano, so he's been there for a minute. So there's bad blood between Anastasia and Vincent Mangiano, who also has a brother running things with him, Philip. They almost physically brawl on multiple occasions, which not supposed to happen when you're the boss of a family and dealing with an underling. But nobody could control Anastasia. Anastasia also felt that Mangiano was kind of doing him dirty, not cutting him in on enough of the profits, and he becomes paranoid that Mangiano is going to kill him if he doesn't turn the tables first. And turn the tables he does. Mangiano goes missing on April 19th, 1951, the same day his brother Philip's body is discovered in Jamaica Bay, which is in Queens, not Jamaica.
And Queens, that's a place in New York, right?
Yeah, wait, are you being sarcastic? I can't tell.
Yes, but not very
Okay.
well.
I don't know, man. I sometimes assume people know everything, but they don't. But you lived here. So that's on me. I'm moving slow. Anastasia is now the acting boss. He's called to meet with the commission. He doesn't admit to killing the Mangianos, which you're not supposed to kill a boss without permission from the other bosses. He does tell them, though, that the brothers were plotting to kill him. So without evidence on his move against them and with the backing of Lucky's right-hand man and boss himself, Frank Costello, Anastasia is named the new boss. Lucky Luciano, by the way, he had been deported to Italy after the war, so he wasn't really involved in the day-to-day of New York. So Albert Anastasia is boss, and all is well. But, of course, that doesn't last long. In early 1952, a civilian gets famous because he notices a wanted bank robber walking down the streets of New York City and alerts the police, who then arrest the bank robber. The civilian gets some fame and does some TV interviews and is lauded as an outstanding citizen. But Anastasia just happens to catch one of his interviews on TV, and he's pissed off. He's not happy. He allegedly says, "I can't stand squealers. Hit that guy." So they do. The guy gets killed, and that, goes against Mafia rules, killing a random civilian like that. But it also enrages the public, who demand to know who killed the guy. So this, of course, gets law enforcement going, and the commission is not happy because this brings the heat down on all of them. They call a meeting, and they start to give Anastasia a ton of dressing down and talking to, but he's a boss himself, so nothing really happens besides Anastasia recognizes he messes up and he kind of, engenders some bad blood and distrust with the rest of them. However, behind Anastasia's back, rising mafia power Vito Genovese starts to plant seeds of doubt about Anastasia with the other mafia heavyweights, about how you can't trust him, he's irrational, he's too violent, he's a wild card, even for a mob guy. They're already nervous about him, so Genovese's maneuvering does not fall on deaf ears, and Genovese, who is Frank Costello's underboss, he's also maneuvering against Costello so he can take over. To do this, he knows he's going to have to take out Anastasia too, because Anastasia's like, the attack dog. He's the violent, crazy one. Genovese also recruits Anastasia's own underboss, Carlo Gambino, in on his conspiracy. It's real Machiavellian stuff here. You can't trust these guys. For all the talk of honor and codes and all that with the mafia, it was always all about killing their own guys and their bosses and all that sort of stuff. Meanwhile, Anastasia is still stepping on toes, this time deciding he wants to get in on the Cuban casino game, going and meeting with Cuban government officials. This is the mid-50s, so Cuba, Havana, it's hot right now. There's one big problem, though. The Cuban casino racket is overseen by Santo Traficante, the Florida mob boss who we've done an episode on, and Meyer Lansky. And those two are extremely powerful in the national underworld. And Cuba is already a very delicate balance where a bunch of mobsters have a slice of the pie, but Traficante and Lansky run the show. And in comes Albert, who wants a big slice of the pie and wants to override them.
Yeah, if you haven't already listened to those shows, Danny I think you've done like 2 or 3, right? On Traficante and Cuba and the CIA and Castro. They're all amazing. So people should check them out if they haven't already.
Yeah, we did a big one on Traficante and a big one on the corporation, which was the Cuban mob in New York. And we did one on Murder Inc., where we talked about Lansky a lot. So all this stuff we've done more sort of fleshed out ones on this other stuff we're mentioning. This, in turn, upsets all the other mobsters. So there's another commission meeting, and Genovese's back at it again, talking about how Anastasia is just out of control. He wants everything. He's too much of a wild card. And he basically makes it so Anastasia is a dead man walking. On Genovese's other front, he orders a hit on Frank Costello in May of 1957, and the shooter tries to kill him in the lobby of his building, but misses and just grazes his ear. He gets the message, though, and he actually retires. Side note, the shooter was none other than Vincent the Chin Gigante, who, If you guys remember, if you're close to my age, he was the guy who used to walk around the West Village in a bathrobe. He feigned insanity for a long time, and I think it worked in the beginning and then did not. Costello retires and lives in the penthouse of the Waldorf Astoria, got into gardening, still powwow with his mafia buds, but dies of a heart attack at 82, natural causes, so not half bad, not a bad run. Anastasia is not so lucky. In October of 1957, he gets taken out while getting a shave at the Barber in the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown. It's not as well known as the Pauly Castellano hit outside Spark Steakhouse, which that's when Gotti makes his move, and Sean, that's where we went when you were here, that place we had you had the giant steaks. I had a medium-sized steak. Yeah. But it's a pretty infamous hit, this one, and there's a photo that's pretty famous of him lying dead next to the barber chairs with his face covered by a sheet. I think, or is it his hand? I don't know. Google it. You'll see. Carlo Gambino takes his place as boss, and we get the infamous and well-known Gambino family. He ends up being one of the most successful bosses ever, and Vito Genovese takes over, and we get the Genovese family, though he ends up going down pretty quick. And the moral of the story is, even these guys, the old-school top-tier mobsters, they betray each other left and right. Much like podcasting, it may seem like it's all glitz and glamour, but, there's no glory to this shit.
I don't know. Those steaks were absolutely gigantic, and that's what I count as glitz.
They were pretty solid, man, and it was a great great meal all around. Anyway, thank you guys for tuning in, and patreon.com/normalpodcast. Sorry if this was a little short. My voice is a little scratchy, and we can't win them all. We win most of them. Actually, do we? I don't know, but yeah. Until next week.